And we're live. We're live, and people are jumping on. So, Rich Farley, thank you very, very much for joining me to talk about your new book. I'm moving the wrong way, which is Drop Dead. It has a
There
very,
it is.
very long subtitle.
Yeah, forget the subtitle. The subtitle, we won't have any time to discuss anything else.
No. And some well-known faces on the cover, the most recognizable probably being Donald Trump's and Roy Cohn. So the book, for everyone tuning in, is about what happened to New York in the 1970s when it went bust and was saved. And, for me, growing up in England in the 1970s, the myth of what New York was like back then was probably the chief reason that, when I was in my 20s and I told my parents that I was going to move to New York, they were deeply worried.
Horrified, yeah.
Yes, because it was a pretty scary place. So first of all, I want to ask you, Rich, I mean, you're a very busy and distinguished lawyer.
Right.
So
keep talking. You're doing great.
So one, why did you want to write this book? I mean, second, how you even had the time, and it's not your first book. But what was it about? Why did you want to write about New York in the 1970s?
This really came out of the second book, where Felix Rohatyn was a chief character in that one. And I became a little bit fascinated with his career because he was a wonderful manipulator of public opinion. And of course, he is best remembered for saving New York. And as I dug in, I learned that it's a little more complicated than that. And it's also it's a fascinating time in New York, too.
Well, and we should just explain for anyone who doesn't know is that Felix Rohatyn was one of the leading bankers at the time. He was a very distinguished gentleman, philanthropist. But he worked, I believe, at Lazard, right?
Correct. He was at Lazard and was, the heir apparent of Andre Mayer, and he was really the first superstar investment banker. He sort of set the protocol and the template for what that ought to be in the 1960s.
Right. And you tell the story, there's a cast of characters, right?
Yes.
Mixture of
well, you have to have great characters. No one's going to read a book about the great librarians of New York in the 1970s.
Right. So let me ask you this: was one reason that you dug into this? Did you get to know any of them at the sort of end of their lives, as it were?
I knew several of them. I mean, I had met Felix a little bit. I knew Beam a little bit. Roy, I did not know. Roy Cohn. Yeah, I did not. I knew of him, of course. And obviously Hugh Carey. I knew. Yeah. And again, my family's been involved in Democratic politics for a long time. And this was the world that I was sort of acculturated in. The sort of clubhouse politics of New York.
Why don't you walk us through? Because you sort of say in the book that there are narratives out there, or there weren't, about why New York descended into this hell.
Yes.
I mean, right, of the massive crime and crack addicts everywhere, broken windows, which Giuliani famously would later come in to clean up. So walk us through what the conventional wisdom was and who was to blame, and then what you discovered.
There are two narratives. There's the narrative on the left that said, when Nixon was elected, and obviously Ford was a continuation of Nixon, they choked off money to New York City, and they punished New York City for being compassionate and told the city to drop dead, hence the cover.
Hence the title.
Right. The narrative on the...
Stop you just there. What do you mean be compassionate?
Because New York City took on a lot of responsibility for things that in most other municipalities, states, or counties do. They contribute 25% of all welfare expenses, whereas most cities have zero. They had a university system. They had a hospital system. They ran their own courts. And New York was thought to be a very liberal place for people who were down on their luck. which is why a lot of immigrants and others, including people from the UK, come to America because it's thought to be a welcoming New York City, in particular, because it's thought to be a welcoming and
Right.
humane place. And the left obviously thinks that's a wonderful thing. And when the city ran out of money, they blamed it on less aid from Washington. Was essentially their answer for why the city went broke.
Now, why do you think what in your reporting suggests is the reason that the city went broke?
Well, it's neither left or right. Now, the narrative on the right was you had a bunch of spendthrift liberals who couldn't control their spending, and their irresponsibility and not going after welfare queens made the city run out of money. In truth, both the conservatives and the liberals, both the Democrats and the Republicans, liked the system exactly the way it was because they could use the patronage and the graft to take care of their own. And some of the biggest spenders of all time were Republicans in those days: John Lindsay, Nelson Rockefeller. So everyone wanted to spend as much as possible, preferably borrowed money, to be able to get as much support, patronage, reelection, all the things. Everyone loves to spend. Nobody loves austerity. So the establishment was in on the grift, as they always are.
Well, but walk us through what the grift is, right? Because as far as
Right.
people who
Sure.
just know the stuff that our parents talk about, or
Right.
it
Right.
or
What is a
what we
fiscal
know.
crisis, Vicky? Let's talk about what a fiscal crisis is. Okay.
Yes.
Cities constantly have to borrow, particularly on a short-term basis, because the expenses of the city are roughly equal 12 months a year. Okay. But the revenues are very lumpy. You pay your taxes once a year, or if you pay on a quarterly basis, 4 times a year. The real estate taxes is 1 times a year, 4 times a year, depending upon what type of a building you are. The aid from Washington and from Albany come to the city on a very lumpy basis. So in order to pay your expenses when due, cities borrow against those receivables, something they call tax anticipation notes in advance of the taxes coming in, revenue anticipation notes in advance of Albany and Washington coming up with the aid. And you're supposed to borrow on a, responsible basis. So what the city did in the 1970s and had been doing for years was borrowing more than they should, because the city's supposed to have a balanced budget, the expense budget.
And whose job technically would it have been to oversee that?
The mayor, the
Maybe.
yeah, the Board of Estimate, the city council, the controller, Harrison Golden. And Beam, remember, was controller before he was mayor. So
Right.
he had been all through this. So there was a fellow named James Kavanaugh in the Budget Bureau, never graduated college, but he was an absolute genius at finding ways to allow the city to borrow illegally. They would do things like, because Wall Street was complicit in all this, because they just wanted the fees from the bond underwriting. They didn't do too much due diligence, and the city is exempt from liability under the securities laws. So the city didn't really care what they disclosed or did. The
Right.
SEC tried to go after Beam and Golden on an individual basis, but by then Carter was in office, so they dropped it. So they would do things like send tax bills to embassies. Well, we all know embassies are tax exempt, but they can take that receivable, walk it down to Wall Street, and Solomon Brothers will underwrite it on the basis of a receivable that's valid. Okay.
So that's a great example of
Yes,
that really is a scam, right?
oh, and that's just that's just for openers. They would do things like Medicaid. Almost always 5% of Medicaid reimbursement is rejected. Well, they would have the receivables be underwritten at 100 cents on the dollar. Okay,
Right.
they would send tax bills to people who've been in bankruptcy for years and years. Okay.
Right.
And, and they would simply just roll these things over. And that worked in the 60s when interest rates are low, right? Because you can always find a way to, hopefully the value of real estate increases and the bad receivables last year are offset by good receivables next year. And when interest rates are 2 or 3% for munis, you never have a problem. You can keep the hustle going forever and ever. But when interest rates start to spike in the early 70s, and then when you have a recession right on top of that in 73, and then you've got Nixon administration pulling back aid, you have the makings of a crisis. Now, that's just
Yes.
one side of the equation. The other side is, where did all that money go? Um,
Right.
you've heard of Shea Stadium, right? You've heard of
Yes.
baseball over there in the UK. Okay. Shea Stadium was named after a lawyer named Bill Shea. Okay.
Right.
And Bill Shea was the most politically connected lawyer of all time. He was best friends with Nelson Rockefeller. He was great friends with Hugh Carey. He came out of the same political organization as Abe Beame in Brooklyn. And when the Pennsylvania Railroad went broke, when they owned the Long Island Railroad, Citibank had a large loan out to the Pennsylvania Railroad. And Nelson Rockefeller and the legislature in Albany decided that they didn't want this loan to go bad. So they arranged for New York State to buy the Long Island Railroad. And they had Bill Shea negotiate on behalf of the state. And a report later on said the railroad is worth a negative 65 million. Now that's a lot of money because this was in the late
Right.
1960s. But they paid 65 million so that city could get repaid 60 million. So there were all
Right.
sorts of games that went on to help the insiders. Um, we
So you've
talked.
talked. Go on. And where in all of this do real estate developers come
Well,
in?
I was about to get to that. The reason why you have Donald Trump on the cover is because you can't sell books unless Donald Trump's on the cover, unless you have a Kardashian. And I searched to see whether Robert Kardashian ever did anything with Meet Esposito. He never did. Otherwise, Kendall Jenner would be on the cover too. But um, Fred Trump's lawyer was a fellow named Bunny Lindenbaum.
Yeah.
Okay. And Bunny's career was created. He was out of a small room in Brooklyn. He met Fred, and all of a sudden, his business exploded. And his best friend, besides Fred, was Abe Beame. Okay. And through Abe, he became a very important figure. He met Mayor Wagner, and he raised a lot of money for Mayor Wagner from real estate interests. And then, he became able to go to Manhattan, and Bunny had the largest real estate business in the city. He got more tax abatements and relief from the city than any other lawyer of his era, or probably any era. And Bunny was through his political relationships with Abe Beame and the Brooklyn Clubhouse, able to do wonders.
Right.
And if all the clients that Bunny had actually paid the taxes they should have, there may not have been a fiscal crisis. So you see here where the real estate interests and lawyers like Bunny, Bill Shea, and Roy Cohn. Everybody now thinks Roy Cohn is some kind of a pariah and right-wing fanatic, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg and
Right.
McCarthy. Roy
Did
Cohn
you did you
was
see
on
The
the.
Apprentice? It's a
I did. It was actually pretty good. It got
yes.
some things were absolutely ridiculous, but I think it captured Roy, and I think it captured a lot of the ethics of the time, which is when the book takes place. But Roy was on the 6-member committee of the New York City Democratic Party Finance Committee. He was an absolute insider. Chuck Schumer used to give his eye teeth to get invited to Roy Cohn's parties because all of the major players, and he was just an assemblyman from Brooklyn at the time, all of the major players were in Roy's orbit. And Roy had a secret, which is absolutely genius. Every time a judge got in trouble, Roy would offer his services to defend that judge pro bono. And he always hired at his law firm the children of judges, no matter how dumb they were. He did whatever it took to ingratiate himself with the establishment in the New York judiciary.
Very
Um,
smart.
as did Simon Rifkind, who was the senior partner at the Paul Weiss law firm. And Rifkin's got a very colorful past. They don't advertise this on the website. It's a very colorful past. He was involved in the disappearance of Judge Crater. I don't know whether you've ever heard that story, but there
I
was
have
a
not.
judge. There was a judge in the I think it was 1930 who disappeared without a trace. And as they investigated, they found out he, ran around with showgirls and gambled with Donald Rothstein. And he had some bad qualities, but Judge Crater got in. They think he got involved with loan sharks and owed money. Anyway, he disappeared without a trace, and he was Robert Wagner, the mayor's father, his law partner, and their clerk was Simon Rifkind.
Who
So
became head of
who
head of Paul
became
Weiss.
a judge and then the head of Paul Weiss. Well, uh, Judge Crater's wife calls up and said, I'm up here in Maine for the summer, and the judge was supposed to join me for the weekend, and he hasn't shown up. And Rifkin told her, he's fine, don't worry about it, everything's okay. A week later, she gets a call from his clerk, the judge's clerk, saying, we have a trial going on, where's the judge? She freaks out, she calls Rifkin. Rifkin says, don't worry about it, everything's fine. Well, she comes to New York, and after about 3 weeks, they finally convince Rifkin to call the cops. And it turns out that he's been missing. His body's never been found. And there's a
Well,
lot of
so it
speculation.
really is a den of thieves.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a lot of, all apologies to James Stewart, but there's a lot of speculation that people knew damn well what happened to Judge Crater, and they'd have to, they all were encouraged to keep their mouth shut. And not long after that, Rifkin got appointed a judge by FDR, who was
right.
obviously an ally of Robert Wagner and Tammany Hall, which was where all these
Yes.
folks in Manhattan came out of.
So, all right. So I think that's a really wonderful explanation of how the grift was very significantly responsible for getting New York into the mess, as you
Right.
say, when interest rates changed. Um, but what about the grift getting out? I thought
Well,
that
let's
was
talk about that. Yeah,
fascinating.
see, that's absolutely fascinating. Okay. Wall Street finally says, we can't loan you any more money. We know you're screwing around with the receivables are phony. The deficits are out of control. The whole thing may come crashing down. And we, the underwriters, are liable under the securities laws for your bad deeds, even though you aren't. Right? That's an interesting dynamic.
Yes.
So Wall Street doesn't underwrite any more bonds. The bond
Yes.
market, the short-term bond market is saturated with New York City bonds because of all these shenanigans. 1/3 of all short-term bonds and municipal bonds in the country were out of New York City. So you're
Right.
saturated. They're not going to buy anymore. So they finally get downgraded by S&P, and that's when the light bulb goes off and everybody says, good God, we've got a real crisis on our hands. Now, the drama then moves from New York City to Albany, right? Because the first stop on the train for more money is always the state. And the state had a problem. It had its own issues. Rockefeller went crazy and spent money he didn't have. And that bill came due when he left. He resigned a year or so before his term ended because he didn't want to deal with the fallout and preserve his chances to run for president in 1976. So now the city's running out of money, and the bond market is not going to underwrite anymore. So Carey starts advancing aid, right? Aid that was supposed to happen in 76, they give in 1975, but that's not enough. They were
Right.
hoping maybe the bond market would open up. It became clear that it wouldn't. So Carey realizes this is now his problem, okay? And he appoints a panel of experts, including Judge Rifkind and Felix Roeden, to come up with a solution. And they hired the greatest public relations carnival barker of all time, John Scanlon. If you don't know anything about John Scanlon, he is an absolute character. He was best friends with your old pal Graydon Carter. So Scanlon comes up with a strategy with Carey and Ian Rowan. Everybody knows the money has to come from Washington. Okay, because the state doesn't, it has its own problems.
Yeah.
It's not going to be able to handle this on its own. And everybody knows Washington's going to come up with the money. Okay, because why? What happens after 1975? 1976, it's an election
It's
year. Okay.
right.
And Gerald Ford, despite promising Richard Nixon, part of the reason why he got appointed when Agnew resigned was he promised Nixon he would not run for president in 1976. But once you're in the White House, you kind of like it and you don't want to leave. So he was going to run for president in 1976. But he had two problems. One was Ronald Reagan, who was coming after him from the right. And if
Yeah.
Ford went too easy on the city and gave the money without too many strings attached, Reagan would savage him. The other problem is he couldn't be too hard on New York because he needed to carry New York to win the election in 1976. And it turned out he lost New York because New York City went against him in record numbers. Only two other elections in history did New York City vote against a Republican in such large numbers up till then. Uh,
Wow.
so he had to try to navigate a course of action here that was tough enough on the city. so that Reagan wouldn't, use that against him, but not so hard that he would alienate New York. It was probably impossible for him to thread that needle anyway. But he got totally outfoxed, okay? Ford said you got to file bankruptcy, default on your debt, and then we'll come in as the federal government as sort of the debtor in possession lender. In a bankruptcy, there's
Yeah.
something called the debtor in possession. And Carrie had promised Abe Beame to go along with whatever Carrie said because Carrie promised he would not force the city to file bankruptcy. Well, you may sit there and say, well, what's wrong with filing bankruptcy? And honestly, there's something to be said for filing bankruptcy if you're in the position the city was in then. Then
Right.
everybody pitches in to incur the pain. The banks and the bondholders have to give a little. The unions with their pensions have to give a little. And everybody shares the pain equally. They didn't want to do that. They don't want to share the pain equally. They want the unions, which is where they get their donations and their campaign volunteers and everyone else, to not have to give up any of their pension funds. No,
Ah,
there's this discussion when the pension funds were lent to the city to be able to keep the liquidity going. And then, of course, the union leaders claim they saved the city. But the truth is, workers under the New York Constitution are entitled to their pensions, even if every dollar of the pension funds are pissed away. It didn't matter. The only
right.
way pensions could be reduced is by a federal bankruptcy filing, because federal law trumps the New York State Constitution. But they didn't want bankruptcy because you get a federal bankruptcy judge who'll start looking around about where the money went. Well, gee, why
Right.
did all those bond proceeds go to pay off Citibank? Why did these things? So the politicians did not want bankruptcy. They wanted to control where the cuts would have to be made to keep Ford happy and to keep the money coming in. So they basically negotiated terms for the loan that would incur pain on the most needy who don't have lobbyists, right? It's the special education programs,
Right.
it's the hospitals, the chest X-rays in poor neighborhoods, and not the unions and not the people who the insiders really care about. So anyway, Scanlon comes up with the strategy that says, look, Ford is going to have to deal with us. We're going to have to deal with him. But no matter what he comes up with, we're going to portray it as the most draconian proposal in history, so that the starting point is over here. And of course, the media in New York is on his side, right? We talked
Right.
today about fake news and all this other nonsense. This has been going on forever. Scanlon had
Right.
all of his buddies lined up. There was a culminating speech at the National Press Corps in Washington when Ford was going to announce that he would finally agree to give money to the city. So the crisis happens in April. I'm not giving the city anything, says Ford. May, not going to give him anything, all the way till October. Finally, in October, the end of October, he's going to give his initial proposal of what it will take to get money from the federal government. And he basically said, you got to file the bankruptcy, we'll give you the debt. That was his starting point. He knew, and everybody else knew, that he was going to prevent the bankruptcy, but he couldn't start there because then Reagan would kill him.
Yeah.
Scanlon took that and portrayed it as, the worst imaginable thing that ever be befallen New York City. The press went along with it. The New York City politicians went along with it. And Ford had no PR effort. It was absolutely shocking. He thought the Ford people thought he would get criticism from Reagan for doing this. He didn't worry at
Right.
all about the New York City people saying, look how, draconian you're being. So he got totally outplayed.
And
And
so, I mean, I would say, our current president wouldn't be making a rookie mistake like that in
no,
terms of
no,
PR.
no,
But
he wouldn't.
but 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 then so particularly Felix Rohatyn, who I always heard was the big name to take
Yes,
responsibility for saving the city. So
yes.
what did he do that was possibly less than glorious?
Well, look, I don't want to demean his service. He
No.
volunteered a lot of time. He was a very effective tactician. Okay. But the so-called great strategic idea that Felix had was the creation of the Municipal Assistance Corporation, the Big Mac, as they call it.
Yeah.
And the Big Mac, which was, by the way, a plagiarism of an idea the bankers came up with months earlier, was supposed to raise $3 billion of bonds to tide the city over until September. Remember, the crisis happens in April. The Mac happens on Memorial Day. It was supposed to keep the city short-term borrowing afloat until September, when they all thought the city would be able to borrow again in the municipal bond market, because they were going to suck that capacity out of the short-term municipal bond market, replace it with long-term MAT bonds, and then they thought things would be stabilized. Of course, the city wasn't able to access the short-term bond market for another 4 years, not another 4 months.
Yeah.
So that's a big failure. And of the three, they only sold 1 billion. They couldn't sell the other two, which is why ultimately they had to rush to Washington, and why they had to go to Tip O'Neill. And Tip O'Neill came up with a strategy that said January 6th is the key date, boys. That's the New York Republican convention. In those days, the delegates weren't all chosen in primaries. You had some that were chosen at the convention, some in primaries. And O'Neill said, Ford's going to want this over, because if the bad blood is there from New York on January 6th, these guys may bolt to Reagan. They may, not give him the endorsement. So Ford's going to want it over by Thanksgiving, is what Tip O'Neill said. And he said, keep it in the headlines, keep the pressure on Ford, but you got to find the money, Hugh, to be able to keep the city going through Thanksgiving. So that's what all these schemes were about. And of course, the MAC was an abysmal failure. Didn't sell 3 billion of bonds. It sold barely 1. But nonetheless, Felix, being himself maybe the second greatest PR person next to John Scanlon,
Right.
he was able to portray all this as a great success. And they all knew Washington was going to be the answer. So the idea that the unions claim they saved the city, the real estate developers, they had a great scheme. The real estate developers said they saved the city because they prepaid their real estate taxes to give the city some liquidity. What they don't say is they got a big tax break to do that.
Yes.
So again, there are all of these mythologies out there.
Right.
And
I'm going to ask you a completely different question.
Sure.
I mean, you are a very, very busy lawyer, partner at a law firm. How the heck did you find the time to do this?
Yeah, you need a respectable reason to not spend time with your family. Okay. And if you tell people you're writing a book, they'll leave you alone and not question why you're, hiding in your room.
I mean, it's absolutely, it's fascinating. And then, tell me,
it's a lot easier these days because everything is digitized and online, and you can basically do, the lion's share of the research right on your laptop.
Well, I think in this case, yes, possibly because a lot of the people are dead, and that's
it. Because I have a law practice, I can't piss off anybody who's still alive, right? You can only write about things that are 50 years old.
Exactly. No, I hear you on that. But you do say in the book that there is a chance this is happening again.
Yeah, well, let's walk through. And I always have this list with me whenever I do one of these things. Loss of jobs in a key industry. Now, New York into the 1950s was the industrial hub of America and therefore the world. Okay. It had lost probably 70% of its industrial jobs by the early 70s. What we've seen recently, because of technological developments and other things, the growth in financial services jobs is not in New York. Now, we haven't seen the loss of jobs yet, but they're not growing. All of the growth in the financial industry is in Texas, is in Florida. And I think it's a matter of time before it shrinks here, okay? Because of taxes, because of cost, because of weather, all kinds of things. So that's a parallel to watch very closely. Number two is you had a recession in 1973 and 74 that precipitated this. First quarter of this year, it looks like we had negative growth. If you have another quarter of negative growth, you have a recession. Okay, so that may be looming. You've got higher interest rates, right? We've seen interest rates rise now again from zero, but still rising, and with tariffs and the federal deficit and other factors, I think rates are going to continue to be elevated. Loss of federal money. This may be the biggest. Okay. If you look at what came in through COVID, Green New Deal, Build Back Better, all of these things were basically used by the city to do operating expenses, right? Now that money is gone with Doge, we got a line there with the chainsaw. the loss of that, I think, is going to have significant consequences. And how inefficient have things become? Right? We don't really know. See, one of the differences now is they've gotten more sophisticated in the graft. You don't just put the idiot brother-in-law on the city payroll where everybody can look at the name and say that's the idiot brother-in-law. You have not-for-profit corporations which provide
Right.
services to the city. And of course, who owns those? Now, who owns? Nobody owns it, but who control it and therefore direct the jobs and who gets the money is now out of the public view. It's a lot harder for people like you to do your job and find out where it's all going. In the old days, if a congressman was friendly to Tammany and the machine, they'd give you a partnership when you retire at Paul Weiss or Shea and Gould. Now they've got 40 million in their personal account. They don't need a job, right? So if you look at all of these markers, I think it does indicate that when the tide goes out, there may be people without bathing suits. And I fear that New York City, which is projecting a meaningful deficit for fiscal 2027, I think we need to keep a close eye on these things.
Wow. That is really sobering. Important, I think. Very important as well. So listen, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you. I mean, we've talked about Paul Weiss in the in the past tense. Um, what are your thoughts on what's happened with the law firms?
Look, I
And
feel bad for anyone who gets in a tough spot, right? The New York legal community is a very close-knit fraternity, and you wish everybody well. I will say, and I'm speaking only for myself here, I think it started with Starr and the Starr Report. Okay, when Ken Starr was at Kirkland, as a partner, he decided to get involved in the impeachment of President Clinton, the Starr Report, and all that. And that's something that never would have happened years ago because the big law firm said, we're not going to get involved in partisan activities. We're not going to put ourselves in the crosshair. There's plenty of good causes we can do. And there are activist law firms out there, not for profits, that specialize in certain types of litigation. But that changed. And I think it changed with Ken Starr. And of course, once a boundary is broken, a norm is broken, it has a tendency to go greater. My own personal view is I'm from the Michael Jordan school. Both Democrats and Republicans hire lawyers just like they buy sneakers. And I want to have friends on both sides of the aisle so that if I have a client in trouble, I can make a call no matter who's in the White House or in Congress.
very, very interesting. Well, maybe I mean, I hate to state the obvious, Rich, but maybe your next book might be about the watershed moment of the ChemStar. I think that's actually that's that's very, very well put. Um, well, I want to thank you for writing this book. It only came out last week, right?
It did. It came out last week. Yep.
So you're busy on tour and doing the thing?
Well, there's no more tours anymore because all the publishing firms are broken. They're all broke. They don't have any money for book tours. Maybe fancy people like you get that, but
Well, I
for
think it depends. It depends on the nature of the book. There are certain
maybe
books
if
that
I could have
people.
gotten Kendall Jenner on the cover, to give me a budget for that.
I think if you got Kendall Jenner on the cover, you'd be on TV. You wouldn't be touring
I I miss
the
I miss
regional.
I miss my moment.
Well, there's always tomorrow. Anyway, I want to thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank
Everybody,
you for having
read
me.
the book because it is important. And I think what you say about what could happen to New York now is really chilling, and we should think about it. Thank you.
Thank you.